And that means that we will get to our conversation with Lily and Holly. Thank you to both of you for sharing your time and talking about this. Lily, I see you first in my line of people who have joined us today, so I'm going to start with you. One of the things that we so often talk about as of late when we as a journalist community are covering the beer industry is this question of what does community mean? And as things have changed and the array of people that we're trying to write about, cover, tell stories, that is changing too. So what does community mean to you in particular?
Well, it's interesting because when I first started working in beer and sort of shortly after writing about beer, my circle of friends sort of, I guess, shrunk to specifically beer people. So for some time, my immediate community and sort of most of my community was just beer people. And for a while, I thought that was sort of great, and I felt really at home, whilst also not feeling very at home because there were so few people I saw in my immediate vicinity like me. And then I think more recently, I've found a really great community of LGBTQ people within beer, and it's a sort of a niche within a niche, really, or sort of like a very small Venn diagram. But it is the most amazing little group of people. And it sort of really changed how I think about community and sort of made me think about the community that I felt when I first found other LGBTQ people and sort of other trans people. And I wrote about this in Welcome to Loneliness, the article I wrote for Good Beer Hunting, which was about how the pandemic is changing how we interact and sort of how it's forced everyone online, like this evening. But I wrote about how it felt so familiar that we were all forced to interact through sort of chat rooms, or not chat rooms, but like digital spaces, and how that felt like the way I'd interacted with those first communities I found in like 2012 or whatever. And finding this community of queer beer people has really sort of forced me to think that community isn't just people you find around you, but like people with whom you find a sense of kinship. And sometimes that is quite broad in terms of like we all like beer and we all like the same kinds of beer or whatever, or it can be more specific. So I guess it's like, yeah, finding that has forced me to think more critically about community and I guess what that means to me. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, tell me a little bit more. That last part, the way that you're thinking critically about it. Could you maybe share with us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, I think for a while I just thought that sort of community was just sort of your group of people and sort of who you spent time with, but it's more an understanding, or it's more, I think, who you share a common understanding with, as opposed to just like people who you just spend time with or speak to. Sorry, knocked my mic over. Yeah, I'm not sure beyond that sort of, yeah.
Holly, you've done reporting both with a quantitative and qualitative aspect of this, which I look forward to talking about as well. But we'll stick with this just in terms of kind of thinking about what community means, especially in context of the way that we write about that and ask that question to sources. Give us a little context. What does that mean to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is kind of similar to what Lily was saying. To me, it is more of a broad concept as well. Like, you know, I actually, when I was thinking about this question last night, I went kind of really big. Like, it's like a state of mind. Like, it's the state of wanting and being wanted, is like how I kind of conceptualize it. It's a mutual energy exchange, like feeling like you're giving as much as you're getting, feeling loved and safe, and feeling free to kind of express exactly as you are in whatever space you're in. So whether that's like a physical place, whether that's in an interaction with another person, you know, or whether it's with a group of people, like that, if I feel like I have community, that's like the feeling state that I'm in. And so like in terms of reporting, or, you know, how I was like exploring that with other people, like that can extend, you know, I asked a lot of people about breweries and like how they feel in breweries and craft beer spaces. And that like I think that translates to that setting. Like when you step into a space, you know how it feels. And when you're with another group of people, whether it's your coworkers, whether it's like your friends in the beer world, your friends outside, you just know how that feels when like you feel welcome, you feel like the person or the place of business is actually making an effort proactively to bring you in, or to let you know that you're appreciated and that you have a place there. And like, again, that can happen in interpersonal reactions. Like I've had friendships where I feel like I'm the one doing all the work and like I'm always asking them to do stuff. And then like those friendships don't, you know, necessarily last forever. And it's very different when you're with a person where you're each making the equal effort. And same goes for beer spaces. Like it's not maybe I'm gonna get ahead into the next questions perhaps, but that, you know, it's not enough, I think, to those of us, especially who, you know, are underrepresented people in some form. Like it's not enough to just be like, yeah, everyone's welcome here. This is just say like it's an inclusive space. Just say everyone can visit, and it just doesn't always feel like that when you walk in. So like that's my long way of saying community is kind of an intangible thing, and it's more of a feeling.
So I want to maybe focus on, I guess this is kind of like a call to action, like a takeaway that people might be able to, when you like the big broad thing that you're talking about and then trying to whittle it down to a more tangible way. I'm curious about asking questions. Like when we're thinking about these stories that have so many layers to them and exist in so many ways in the world around us, but say if we're just wanting to talk to somebody or a group of people about the atmosphere of tap rooms, like you're talking about, and the way that people can feel comfortable in these spaces. Is there a way that you found, Holly, and Lily will have you jump in afterward as well, please, the way that you found an effective way to kind of have these questions come up, like a good way to approach these conversations with sources as a way to kind of really pick out deeper level feelings or understandings of what this means to people?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of, like you said before, went at it kind of from multiple angles. Like in the survey, I ran a, you know, large survey for anyone who isn't aware for this article that I did, where there were free answer questions. And so I explored that idea by asking, you know, kind of both, do you feel like the industry is inclusive, and do you feel like craft beer spaces are inclusive, and do you feel like they're diverse? I'm kind of trying to get at it from two different sides in that way. And I included like definitions of what I meant by those terms as well, to try to suss out like, okay, what's the vibe they're putting out there, and how does it actually feel to be in that space? Like, do you see other people who look like you there? You know, what are the attitudes of like your colleagues or coworkers like there, since this was a survey of workers? But then also in conversations, like asking those same questions. And I mean, I did ask specifically about any experiences of like not feeling welcome people had as well as, you know, what makes this space feel, I just asked even what makes the space feel comfortable to you. You know, what are some like indications that, you know, that make you feel welcome? Like when you walk in, what are you looking for? And obviously a lot of the time people are saying that, you know, and I would agree with this too, if there's other people who look like you, if there's other people who identify the way you do in a space, like the presence of other people, getting back to that idea of community, is probably the biggest part of it, but that there are subtle clues as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's answering your question. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah. Well, let's build on that, Lily, too. Thinking about both the research, because you've done both reporting as well as written kind of well-researched essays on this too. When you have covered underrepresented communities in beer, what are some of the big questions that you maybe start with, but then kind of work down to try to find the deeper meaning of what you're trying to write about?
So, I mean, for the most part, I've mostly sort of written, I guess, from my own personal perspective. But when I have written about sort of the state of LGBTQ representation in beer or in a specific space or something, I generally start with sort of, do you think that there's been much change in how queer people are treated in the industry or in terms of representation or whatever? And the answers are usually the same, which is usually quite negative. And then the sort of the follow-up question is often what more could be done, and that's a difficult one because I think most people or a lot of people I've spoken to don't seem to have any answers. There's just a need for something better or more to be done. But yeah, I generally start with sort of just a broad, where are we, what's happening.
Can we maybe dig deeper into that too? Because I know, Holly, this is something that you've spoken about coming out of some of the reporting that you've done, this idea of beer being inclusive but not diverse. And I'd like to just think about this from a reporting context, how that shows up in the stories that we write, because I think it's been well documented in both trade media as well as major media that diversity broadly is an issue. And so I'm curious, when we talk about the reporting and storytelling that we do, if there are maybe stories that maybe haven't been as reported on that we may see because we are like in and around the industry so much. Lily, this could be UK specific or just broadly. When we think about this broader challenge of inclusive but not diverse in the terms of storytelling, are there things that you feel like you've written about or thought about that deserve more attention?
I also just want to touch before I get to that, sort of on the idea of like beer being inclusive and not diverse, because I've been thinking a lot recently about whether or not beer is entirely inclusive. And the sort of the thing I keep coming back to is like, you can put a rainbow sticker on the door of your pub, but it doesn't mean shit if queer people don't know it's there, if it's just sort of waiting for people to trickle in as opposed to reaching beyond that. And I've been trying to think about how we can be more inclusive in terms of like casting the net out further whilst also still being quite a specialist subject or a niche interest. And I haven't actually got very far with that, which I think is part of the issue. But sorry, I've forgotten your question. I'm very nervous. I'm sorry.
Oh, I think you're doing just fine. I guess I'm just trying to think of, with the stories that we tell about broader challenges of inclusivity, diversity. I think both whether it is a trade publication like VinePair or a national here in the US, a national publication like USA Today. Like, there have been issues here that have been covered. And the Brewers Association in the last couple of years has been very open about talking about the findings of their own survey results and the challenges and where they're trying to find solutions. And I think in this group, both with you and Holly and the people on this call as well, like, there's an understanding of the industry that's obviously a bit more in depth than USA Today or CNN or something like that. And so I guess I'm curious, like, when you're thinking about these kinds of stories, if there are things that are being missed that, we as a collective group of reporters who think more critically about this than these larger publications or media areas, if there are things that, like we are best fit to try to investigate a little bit more, or push, or just try to learn more about?
That's a really great question. Can I pass that on to Holly and have a think?
Yes, Holly, is there a space here that you might be okay talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that digging into like the performative aspect of these things versus what's actually happening is something we're kind of uniquely equipped to do, like holding people, breweries, organizations accountable for what they've pledged to do, or also like just helping close this kind of disconnect between the inclusive but not diverse chasm. Like a lot of respondents to my survey, just a lot of people I've talked to in the industry in general, like are very insistent on this idea that beer is inclusive even though it's not diverse. And I talked about this in the article, but like to me those are mutually exclusive. Like you can't have a truly inclusive industry if there aren't people from different backgrounds represented. And a lot of the owners I've talked to, just the owners who are white men generally, but even some who aren't, have a hard time like wrapping their heads around this. And I don't know if it's just because people want beer to be inclusive so badly, or if they just don't understand, like what Lily was saying, how there's an extra step they have to take to reach out, which is kind of what I was getting at as well, with like the community being a mutual exchange. Like when I was in the middle of running the survey, I went to one of the breweries here where like I know the owner, and he walked up and was like almost in a panic, like, I saw your survey, I took the survey, like, I don't know what to do. I post jobs all the time and I want diverse people to apply and no one's applying. Like, what do I do? And I was like, whoa, dude. And like, was like, well, I have some suggestions, and like, had a conversation with him about it that hopefully helped. But that seemed like a common perception, and that's even within the industry. So I think like that's one part of it, of what we can do, is kind of to help close that gap for people. And yeah, again, just like, someone like a USA Today may report on, oh, there was this diversity initiative that was launched. Great. Isn't that great? Look, it's more diverse now. And that's only the beginning, so.
Lily, oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think like sort of to that point, we can, as a sort of a much more specialized sector, we can hold people accountable in that way. Like what sort of springs to mind when you were talking, Holly, there was a brewery in London who last summer, one of their warehouse employees like heckled a trans woman as she walked past with some like quite unpleasant transphobia.
Yeah.
And in the statement that they issued, they sort of just said, "Oh well, we're an inclusive and like an inclusive and diverse company, so we're really upset that this happened." And sort of no one picked up on it. And I spent a lot of time thinking, like, are you just inclusive because you say you are? And it's the same thing as like sticking a rainbow sticker on your door. It's like, we're diverse and inclusive. We welcome everyone. It's like, well, if you're not posting your jobs in sort of anywhere beyond beer spheres, then how is anyone who isn't like the majority of the beer industry, which is white cishet people, how is anyone going to find that and then want to come in?
Yeah.
And similarly, like anyone outside the industry looks in and sees the same group of people everywhere. Like, yeah. So in short, I think sort of holding accountable, asking those questions, and sort of looking at more in depth. And Holly, as you say, like if USA Today sort of ran that story, it would be like, oh great, they with specific regard to this brewery, they ran like a diversity and inclusivity training program, so the problem solved. And it's like, well, is it in the slightest, or was it just a training program forced upon people who probably took no notice?
Yeah.
So there's something both of you are talking about here, this idea of accountability, that I find really interesting. And this leads me to another question about asking questions. When, Holly, when you have that exchange with an owner who's confused about, the way that they may support or talk about things when they're taking their survey, or Lily and the anecdote you're sharing here, there is, I think, the need to ask follow-up questions to push them a little bit. And like inherently, this is a topic of which people may have a level of discomfort or difficulty talking about too. Lily, I've got you here since you're just answering. So if it's okay, I'll start with you. Like when we think about that next step, so they told us in this case, their response to this incident, like what's an effective way for us who have this kind of more in-depth knowledge of the beer industry and the people in it to ask follow-up questions and do it in an effective way that can get answers that are meaningful?
Well, I think my instinct often is to sort of ask quite a question that's easy to get out of, just because my worry is I don't know, just sort of offending someone or whatever. But to push past that, I think often the best way is to ask about like, okay, so what are you doing? Or like, what do you want to do? As opposed to sort of an idea of like, what do you think is the right answer? Or what do you think is the best looking thing to do? But it's like, okay, well, what do you plan on doing? And if it's like not the right answer, then there's work to be done there. Not that there's sort of necessarily right or wrong answers, but if someone just says, oh, I'm going to just put diversity and inclusion training in place and sort of wash my hands of it and be like, okay, well, why it like, is there more that you could do? Or is there like, is that the right thing to do? So sort of, I guess, the phrase that's coming to mind is foot on the throat, but that's probably a little intense. But yeah.
Let me throw this back to you. It sounds like what you're talking about is maybe offering off a softball question just to kind of maybe bring things back to a shared level, and then so that's the question that they may feel comfortable answering or getting out of that you're talking about, and then following that up with something that may be more harder or a bit more in depth.
Yeah, I think so.
It's constantly, and Holly, maybe this is a place where you can pick up as well too, like this balance of comfort where you want to have a meaningful conversation with the source for the story, but you know this may be difficult for them to talk about in a meaningful, emotional way. Is there a particular tactic, really is the best way to describe it, like when you're approaching conversations like this and the follow-up questions are going to be the really important ones? What is the effective way that you find yourself doing it?
Well, for this particular story, I could kind of, I think like vulnerability is often a good approach for lots of things, and kind of offering your own experience as part of it to help people feel more comfortable sharing of themselves too. Kind of a philosophy to life, I suppose, of mine as well. But like in this story, I was not all stories does that work for, because maybe you don't have a personal experience with everything you're reporting on. But in this case, I did. And I, if I was talking to other workers, could be kind of like, hey, I've had this type of experience somewhere. Like, have you ever experienced something like that? What was that like for you? Here's what it was like for me. That's how a lot of these conversations went for me. And I actually, like, it helped me so much in my own personal journey of like, I haven't been out or even really like accepting and aware of my identity for a super long time. And honestly, this project and talking to these other people helped with that substantially. And so being able to meet people kind of where they are and find the common ground, which you can, I think that works across subject matter too, actually. So just finding the common ground in whatever the subject is with whoever the person is, I think that can kind of help break down some of those defenses a little bit and make people feel comfortable speaking more freely.
Holly, I'm going to ask a silly question based on what you just said, because I think you're bringing up a really important point. I am a straight white male. I do not have shared life experiences to the examples that you're talking about. But I certainly want to be better at the way that I can talk to people and report and tell stories as they come up in the span of my own professional career. For other people on the call who may have similar identity, is there a good way for us to be aware? Like, we're going to be blind to things regardless. That's just the way that we kind of function in life. But is there something, when you're talking about that, you get to share your shared experience, which helps to build on that connection? Is there something I can do better? At least, if only just to make myself more aware of where those shortcomings are.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think like an easy way is always to just kind of start conversations if it's someone you don't know, or even if it's someone you know and you've never had the conversation, like you can just even ask kind of like, or be like, here's, like you just did actually, here's my pronouns. What are your pronouns? Here's how I identify. Do you feel comfortable sharing that? And I mean, that's good to do in any story that you're reporting anyways, because you can't assume. But just in general in life, you know, I think that that can be helpful. Like, I have an awkward time sometimes in conversation with people if it's like, I don't know how I should refer to myself, how they're perceiving my identity, you know, like those kind of things can get a little awkward. So to put it out there up front can be helpful. I think that's one approach.
I'm going to ask one question of Lily. I'm just going to do a quick pause. We'll jump into Q&A if anybody has any questions in just a few minutes. So please feel free to put something in the chat box, or if you're able, just hang with us for a few more minutes. Because I think, Holly, what you're mentioning here reminds me of, there was a note that I took, Lily, I think it was a video that you were on from camera, and it was I think it was talking about the Queer Brewing Project. And you had this really great line where you said, we need to change the idea that the responsibility of driving change lies with those who need it most. And I think there's crossover here with what we're talking about when, you know, there's, you know, Brian, straight male, and I want to be able to effectively tell stories when I can. And there's a lot of people like me. Who are telling stories of and around beer too. Could you maybe take us, I guess that quote, give us an idea of the value of what that is when we talk about the need to change this idea that, you know, it's not just people who recognize or identify as an underserved community are in charge of teaching us, that like there's other things that we need to do. Could you talk to us a little about what you meant by that?
Well, I think, yeah, so I've thought about that idea since I wrote my first sort of ever piece really for Good Beer Hunting, from both sides. But I think, yeah, it always sort of feels like it falls to us, whether that's queer people or Black people or people with disabilities, like to fight for the things that we need. So to fight for greater representation, or fight for better treatment across the industry, or so many different things. I think it always feels like it falls to us, but I think as well, it often just does, because we inevitably are the authorities on our own sort of subjects and identities. And I think that one thing, I guess it ties into what you just asked Holly, like what's one thing that we could start with? And it's like, read, like educate yourself. Because I think often when we speak to people who are not like us, we expect to some extent them to educate us, whereas approaching a story and approaching someone you want to talk to with some understanding of where they're coming from, or the issues that they've faced, or the things that they're dealing with, as opposed to just going, hello, I know nothing about this situation, please tell me everything, because that's putting an unnecessary load of emotional labor onto them. So sort of approaching it with, I've read about this, I understand some of this, like no one's expecting you to be an expert, but by coming to it from perhaps on a more slightly neutral ground, as opposed to teach me everything and then also sort of fix everything yourself. It's sort of, I'm coming on this journey with you in any way I can, if that makes sense.
That's such a good answer. I so agree with so much of that. Sorry to jump in.
No, not at all. Like I think I've been asked questions in the past where it's like, explain what trans is. I'm like, go fucking Google it. Like, then we can talk.
I'm Holly. I'm gonna finally bring up on screen real quick. I'm gonna share screen the story that you've been referencing. This is all in the Chosen family. This story it was a two-parter, to be clear. Was particularly unique because of the research that you did. A very a far-reaching survey, which gave you a lot of both good quantifiable information as well as anecdote from people as well. And so this might be a good place to then lead into Q&A with everybody, continuing our conversation. Could you just share with people some of the, maybe not just the big takeaways, but some of the things you learned from your reporting and survey taking that you found particularly powerful?
Well, I kind of mentioned it already before, but what I had suspected was kind of confirmed with the big disconnect between people think it's inclusive, but it's not diverse. And it's like, well, it turns out it's not either. And no matter what people want to think, it's just not. And I think one of the most striking things to me that a couple things that I didn't know I was looking for. One was that almost everyone I spoke to who, especially with the owners, but really with everyone, I spoke to so many people who just felt like, I know there's other queer people in the industry. I know there's other people out there like me, but I don't know where any of them are. And that everyone, like, that there wasn't much of a sense of community. And that everyone felt like they were the only one. And this is something that is echoed across the queer experience in every sector and just in life. I think we always feel like we're the only one, and there's lots of reasons behind that, I suppose, but that was really striking to me, that because I'm speaking to all of them and I'm like, but yes, you're right, there are more of you than you think. The representation was stronger, I think, than I was expecting, but everyone felt like they were alone because they're not connected, and everyone was so fragmented all over the country. They're even fragmented within the city. I mean, I'm speaking to multiple people in Seattle who are like, I only know one or two other people. And I'm like, y'all are just a couple of miles away. So that was pretty striking. I also found it interesting that of the categories of LGBTQIA+ people, the largest represented category in my research, at least, was bisexual people. And as the terminology is tricky, but as someone who I guess I'm bisexual, pansexual, I just love people. Terminology can get tricky, but that was interesting to me, especially because bisexual erasure is kind of a big problem in the queer community as well. And I know, I'm also non-binary, and I feel like a lot of communion with people who identify as trans in that way as well too, where it's like, there's a lot of just kind of feeling like you don't fit in anywhere, even with your own people. And so again, just that coupled with kind of the fact that everyone's like, I'm the only one. It's like, but there's more of us.
We need some sort of bat signal.
Yeah. Well, and I started at least the Facebook group to try to bring everyone together, which I think has still remained fairly small. I think it's mostly still people I talked to from the survey that are in it, but hopefully that can grow a little larger, because there needs to be some organization, I think, or larger resource, but maybe I'm getting off topic now.
I think, so what you're saying, I think it connects back to the first conversation that we had in this 5W series, January 7th, Liz Garibay, we were talking about history in beer. And she gave this great anecdote about the importance of diversifying our sources as reporters, that she kept on seeing the same old white men historians telling this new versions of same stories on these panels at conferences. And Liz did a great job emphasizing, and this isn't just to say we need to tell a story about underserved communities and point out people for their roles in them, but people you're a brewer, like if you work as a brewer, the rest of it can, like you can write a story and include a voice of a brewer who represents a underserved community perhaps. And that doesn't have to be the reason you're talking to them. Like they could just be a very skilled brewer whose insight and expertise is going to lift your story up. And so I think there is a need to be proactive on our part as reporters to find opportunities to share voices, if only just for the sake of sharing them as experts and people who have these lived experiences, not perhaps solely as I'm going to write a story about the LGBTQI plus community and I need to have people talking there. Like they can just normally function in the reporting that we do.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we need to actively put more work into as well, because I think the sort of the low hanging fruit is the white dude brewer, and he's just sort of everywhere. So like it does take more work, but I find like inevitably when you get a more diverse group of sources, you get a more diverse range of experiences and ideas and everything. Like, I guess I'm just chiming in to say that like it takes more work, but it's worth it.
So I want to open up to questions from the group. I've got a question from Beth. Thank you for asking. Holly, we'll start with you because I think you had brought up this originally. Beth was curious about just best practices in terms of asking sources for their identity. So how they self-identify. Like, is that just something as simple as upfront, just when you start a conversation, just starting there?
I think with pronouns for sure that's kind of I will often start interviews anyways by asking kind of what's your job title or, whatever relates to the story I'm writing. So just like folding it in with that. I don't think you always need to ask about identity. I think you probably often don't, like I did for my story because it was about sexual orientation and gender identity. So I guess just use your discernment there. If it's going to serve the story, then I think it's okay to just ask, do you feel comfortable sharing how you identify or what your orientation is? But I think pronouns you could easily just at the beginning of any conversation kind of like, do you mind just giving me your full name, job title, and the pronouns you use if you're comfortable, because you're going to have to use pronouns for them in your stories. So might as well get them right. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. And
yeah.
Follow up.
Yeah, this kind of touches on what you were just talking about, like getting diverse sources, not just for stories about diversity and inclusion. And I have started to ask people like, hey, we're just getting started, like what's your job title, pronouns. And then sometimes I'll say, if you're comfortable sharing like your racial identity, your sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, is that typically the best? Sometimes I feel like it's a little bit clinical or not relevant to the story, but I still like to say like, okay, I'm just doing reporting about something generic, like not about diversity or inclusion, but having that representation. So I guess I'm just curious, like, should I just continue to be kind of upfront about it and just be like, hey, if you're comfortable share these things with me, or is it just not always necessary because it seemed I don't want to come off as like tokenizing?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just want to jump in. I think sometimes it can feel quite sensationalistic, like I've been written about before through what I do with Queer Brewing. It's like, Lily Waite, who's trans? And sometimes it's like, yeah, I mean, it's relevant to what we're talking about, but sometimes it's just like, you don't need to bring it up. But at the same time, sometimes when I read about someone else in the beer world who's trans or queer or whatever, it's like, oh, there's someone else like me, like, and it feels like representation. So I guess it just depends on context and whether or not it's so I mean, sometimes if it's irrelevant, it's still relevant in or useful in some sense. But I think just dropping it in arbitrarily just to be like, look, a trans person, it's a bit like a bit sensationalistic, I think.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because it is like a almost feels conflicting in that way. But I think again, just if there's absolutely no relevance to the story, then maybe don't ask. Sometimes stuff will just come up in conversation too. So if it's not super important, maybe just kind of feel out how the conversation goes. And sometimes people will just, volunteer stuff like, oh, because I identify this way, I had this experience. And yeah, I would probably be inclined to say just let the conversation guide it if it's not directly relevant. But if it is, then yeah, I think just asking up front is okay and can be welcome.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah, if it's a list of like 100 IPAs, don't be like, Lily, who's gay, likes this beer.
Yeah.